This is Grace Notes. I'm Alan Button, and pleased to have as our guest in the studio today, Joe Justice. Joe is a retired employee of Firestone, having served the company for some 33 years, but more significantly perhaps a man who loves music and has experienced a lot in his life that music ties together, and he has been very involved as well in the Whirligig Park in Wilson, North Carolina. Let me stop there by way of introduction and say welcome, Joe. Thank you for being here.
Good to be here. It really is.
Let's start, if we could, Joe, by having you tell us where you got your start.
Well, I was born in Wilson, North Carolina. At the age of 7, moved to New Bern, North Carolina, and later on moved back to Wilson, North Carolina. Growing up in New Bern as a child made such an influence on me, a big impression. My love for history and my love for music ties back to my roots in New Bern, North Carolina.
Speaking of history and New Bern, of course, was the first capital of North Carolina.
It was. New Bern was settled in 1710 and became the first capital shortly thereafter, later moved to Raleigh, North Carolina. But its early history is quite influential. It's just a beautiful time in the life of our nation.
And, of course, New Bern has been the subject of national news just the last couple of weeks with Hurricane Florence having been hit very significantly.
That's really terrible. I've been through several hurricanes in New Bern, but nothing like this. I still have family in Oriental, New Bern, Hampstead, down near Topsail Island, and all of them have been affected. So I've had some damage at my house too, but I don't have to look very far to see the real pain.
Well, speaking of such experiences and pain and growing up and so on, when did you first start working, Joe?
Well, my dad installed ceramic tile, and I used to help him mix mud and carry it to him in 1-gallon paint buckets. I think I was about 8 years old then. Later on, as I grew up, I took on a morning paper route, News and Observer, had the waterfront route, which took me into the historic section of New Bern. Got to meet a lot of nice people, mostly little old ladies that invite you up to look at their furniture and sit on the porch and chat. And that was just wonderful memories.
Yeah, it occurs to me that being a newspaper boy back in those days was a little bit different from what it is today.
Well, some of my fondest memories are carrying the newspaper. You meet such interesting people, and at the same time, you may not appreciate it when you're that young, but as you get older, you recall those memories.
Where does music come into this story?
Well, that's interesting. Growing up, I guess you might say my situation was a little bit on the poor side. So I was pretty much limited to listening to country music and
on the radio.
On the radio, and you know, some local folks would play country music. They 3-chord music, you might call it. In the 7th grade, our teacher surprised us one morning and said, we're going to walk over to the Sudan Temple, which is about 3-4 blocks away from the school, and we're going to listen to the North Carolina Symphony. And when I first walked in, you could hear the musicians tuning their instruments and a little bit of talking in the background, but I was just overwhelmed. I'd never seen those instruments. I'd never seen a cello, never seen violins. I've seen fiddles. I've never seen the brass section like they had. To me, drums was just a little snare drum you'd see in high school or something, but it was just such a wonderful experience. And then as it got quiet, they started playing Blue Danube, which, going from country music to symphonic orchestra music was just a revelation. It really...
Some waltz by Strauss, huh?
Strauss, in fact, I have his collection of waltz at the house. I just fell in love with that music. There was other music there, oboes, clarinets, saxophones. This was a whole new world to me, and it made such an impression. It really propelled my life from, I didn't have to be poor anymore. I was rich. I'd gone from poverty to cultural richness.
What a great story, and what a testament to the impact of a real gem here in the state, the North Carolina Symphony.
I actually come to the doctor in Rocky Mount. His wife plays in the symphony. And when he told me that, I asked a lot of questions. And I probably spent about 15 minutes of our appointment time telling him about growing up in New Bern and about how much the symphony had meant to me and that kind of music.
Well, Joe, that's a great introduction to the music. Let's hear it. Blue Danube by the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra and Herbert von Karajan. And Blue Danube, by the way, as you well know, was composed by the Austrian Johann Strauss II in 1866. Here it is, Blue Danube. What great music, Joe. Blue Danube, as I understand it, the most famous waltz ever. If you're just joining us, our guest today is Joe Justice. I mentioned earlier that Joe is a retired employee of Firestone, and as I understand it, after retirement, or maybe during retirement, you got into woodworking of some kind? Tell us about that.
Well, growing up in New Bern, furniture has always impressed me. I wasn't very good at doing anything with furniture, and after I retired, I kind of committed myself to learn all I could about woodworking, taking classes, Roy Underhill and a lot of local furniture makers, just to involve myself in that because of the influence of growing up in New Bern and the beautiful furniture. It's just a passion I had.
And you actually have your own business now involved in restoring furniture? Is that, or restoring wood?
Well, I was
explain it.
Okay. Well, I needed to get a business so I could keep up with profits and loss and pay taxes and things like that. So I came up with the name of Artisan's Accent. Artisan being one that's involved in working with his hands, skilled craftsman, and accent because we see a building, but it takes a lot of people to make the building look pleasant, so to speak, embellish the building to make it be special. So Artisan's Accent is the name I chose, and I would restore antiques, furniture, work with some furniture makers that I would do repairs for them. Hart Wiggins in Wilson, Ray Etheridge, who are just very good local craftsman. And then I had the opportunity to go to work at the restoration site with Vollis Simpson Whirligigs.
Very good. Well, we'll talk about that shortly at greater length. I understand, too, that your woodworking is not limited to antiques. You were telling me about a young fellow named Jeremiah that got the benefit of some of your woodworking skills. Tell us about that.
Jeremiah's a special kid. He's autistic. I met Jeremiah through Chrissy Ravitt. She actually owns a studio. She recorded my music, and she teaches and works with kids that have special needs. And one of her students was Jeremiah, and he loved to play drums, but he didn't have any drumsticks. So I said, well, I think I can fix that. I went to the house and found some old maple and took it down to the shop, and I turned them a set of drumsticks and also made them a little presentation box to put it in. And I think it helped me more than it did him, just to be able to know that I was a part of his growing and developing in music.
Well, speaking of music, take us back again to how you got into music after your experience with the symphony. What's your music history from that point on?
Well, I believe it was 1966, 67. My dad bought me an old cheap guitar, and it really was uncomfortable to play. Literally, you would play until your fingers would bleed, and he said, well, you got to form calluses. So I worked on it until I got some good calluses and learned to play. At that time, we had a pretty broad spread of different genres of music in the 60s. The British invasion, so to speak. You had country western. You had folk music, Peter Palmieri, Bob Dylan, Donovan. So I kind of latched on to the folk music end of it. It's simple to play, and they sound good. And folk music, it had a story behind it. So I think all music has a story.
Does that mean you're a singer too?
Well, you might want to stretch a point. Well, the Bible says make a joyful noise. Let's leave it at that.
You can do that just fine.
I can make a joyful noise. So I started playing that, and then about the 10th grade, I went to live with my grandfather in Stumpy Point, North Carolina. And then I came back to New Bern. My parents had moved, so I went to go stay with some friends at the beach, and they had just started a summer ministry called Koinonia Coffee House. It was started by the Methodist missionaries from Duke University. Uh-huh. And they gave me a place to stay and gave me the stage, and I played my folk songs there at the coffee house during the summer. I think that was 1967, 68, mm-hmm. somewhere along in there. And that's where my music took me at that time.
Let me have you say something, Joe. Have you broaden your comments on music, and tell me what it is about music that you think makes a difference in people's lives.
Well, I think we have a tendency to live in a two-dimensional life, either up or down, left or right. Mm. And I think music is, I might say, five-dimensional. It gives the fullness of life. It embellishes life, so to speak. It makes life worth living. It gives you something to look forward to, and it gives you something to lay down with quietly at night and fall asleep in a peaceful manner. Like any art, I think music is the outward expression by the artist of the inward interpretation by the artist of the world in which he lives. So it is an art, but it's kind of like one of the senses. It gives the fullness to life to me. Life would be sad if there were no music.
Without music. It occurs to me that you're talking about something that connects the mind and the heart. Music has a way of doing that.
Yeah, the mind, the heart, the spirit, the soul, it really is the connecting point between the trinity of our being. I really believe that. It's the fine thread.
Well, tell us about this song that you've identified by Harry Belafonte.
Well, I think I love everything that's folk, and Harry Belafonte sang Jamaican folk songs, and it's such happy music, and yet they all have a story, as folk music does. They have a story, and I particularly like Jamaican Farewell. My grandfather was a fisherman. So this talks about going out on a ship and coming back, finding his way to Jamaica, meeting a girl there in Kingsport, and he had to leave her. So it's a song that's full of adventure, full of anticipation, coming back to Kingsport, and also the sadness of the relationship of having to leave the one girl that he loved.
Very good. Well, let's hear it. Jamaica Farewell by Harry Belafonte.
Little girl in Kingston Town.
Another great song, Joe. Jamaica Farewell by Harry Belafonte. Joe, you were telling us about what music does for you, how it works for lots of us. And I know before we came in the studio, you said, I love the crooners.
No,
tell us about that. Why?
Well,
as I said before, that maybe predates you a little bit. At least some of the crooners do.
Well, I don't mind. Yeah, they do. But in the 60s, you had the great entertainment shows. You had the Dean Martin show, Smothers Brothers. You had other shows on TV, and they were just great to watch. And you had to fall in love. I love music that's sentimental and music that talks about love and happy things. And who could better do that than say Dean Martin in a song That's Amore, or Christmas song by Perry Como, Bing Crosby, all those folks. And this was the time when my music was kind of broadening out from, say, just country western to there's a whole world out there, and these folks really impressed me.
Well, Joe, your interest in music obviously is broad, and I certainly appreciate that, being in the music business myself. It occurs to me that music, as you've suggested, says something about who we are and our history. And let me have you pick up on that point and talk about how Vollis Simpson fits into your story and some of the history we've been talking about.
Well, as I got older, got married, had children, I kind of put the guitar down for a while. And then my kids grew up, got their educations, and moved, and started picking my guitar back up. But I didn't really have anything that inspired me, I just finished working with Firestone, and, that's work. So, what do you play, work songs? So I had the good fortune of becoming involved with the Vollis Simpson Whirligig project. Now, he's a great artist, the folk artist of North Carolina. His work, it's the folk art of North Carolina.
Yeah, I actually, let me emphasize that point. We're talking about the folk art known as whirligigs that Vollis Simpson created. And in fact, in 2013, the General Assembly identified the whirligigs created by Vollis Simpson as the official folk art of the state of North Carolina.
That's pretty interesting. I had met Vollis before I even knew of the park or the bringing of the whirligigs to downtown from his farm. I had met him. I don't know him very well personally, but having worked on all his whirligigs, the painting, the structure, preparation, the cutting the reflectors, the woodworking involved, I feel like I know him in an intimate way from an artistic viewpoint, so to speak. Now, it's hard to work around people like that and they not inspire you. So part of my job is giving tours also for Vollis Simpson Whirligig Park. And I would go home at night. And literally, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, and these little tunes would be in my head. And I changed from my regular six-string, steel-string guitar and bought a little classical guitar that more suits the music. And I started laying out the music that just came to me in kind of a chronological order of the life of Vollis, being born in 1919, going through the Depression, going through World War II, up to the time he started his business in Lucama, and until he started building the whirligigs. And then it kind of shifts from that to how it affected my life, actually, from the working on the whirligigs to the end of the program. And the last song is just a farewell to a great friend and artist.
We'll hear that song here in just a minute or two. For those of our listeners who may not know what whirligigs are, give us a definition.
Well, if you could imagine a big pinwheel in the air or a windmill, and yet the whirligigs is just that. Some of these structures are 50 feet tall, some 55, 60 feet long, but they're all windmills. And strangely enough, where you and I might keep a journal or a photo album of our life, you can walk through the park and look at the whirligigs, and they're actually a picture story of the life of Vollis Simpson from the time growing up on the farm and his experiences in World War II. He actually built his first whirligig when he was in Saipan in the South Pacific. It was a crude structure made of bomber parts, B-52, B-25, and other things. And it was you might say, a fan blade in the air tied to a shaft that turned some wooden paddles inside a bucket. And that's how they used to wash their clothes. They probably had the cleanest outfit in World War II.
What did he make the whirligigs out of after that?
Well, when he came back from the war, he had been farming with his brothers, and he said, I'll help you farm, but I want to start my own business, and opened up a Vollis Simpson welding and repair shop in Lucama, North Carolina. Now, the 50s was very much like the turn of the century Industrial Revolution. A lot of buildings being built, and a lot of machinery, and still a lot of farm work. So he did a lot of repairs for local farmers on equipment and machinery. And then when he would also change out machinery in factories and stuff. But I think growing up in the Depression, the one thing you didn't do is throw anything away. So he kind of kept everything that he had salvaged from his work. And it kind of accumulated around his shop. And then after he retired, this is another amazing fact. He did not start building these big whirligigs till after he retired. I couldn't imagine that. He was 62 when he retired. And I had asked him, I said, Vollis, where do you get your ideas from? He said, son, I wake up in the middle of the night, these things turning in my head. So in my mind, he was reliving the events of his life, growing up on the farm and the time he spent in the war. And there's one particular whirligig that has a man on a unicycle riding, and this is about 40-foot structure.
This is in the park, isn't it?
This is in the park.
I've seen that one.
Yeah, and below it has an airplane and a helicopter, and we call it carousel. But that's like Vollis saying, this is where we've come from in my life, from riding a unicycle to flying airplanes and helicopters. And he served in the Army Air Corps during World War II, so he got to see all the events that associated with the Pacific Theater, up to and including he was over there when they dropped the bomb on Japan. So if you get a chance to go to the park, just, I had an art teacher one time ask me, look at a painting, and say, well, what do you see in that painting? Nothing, But if you look at it from a different view, you can actually see the life of Vollis. And it spans a great time in the history of America.
Well, Joe, we're out of time, but I want to say that I appreciate your appreciation for history and the life of men like Vollis Simpson and how you tie it together and bring it to become a part of your own life. It's an inspiration to hear you and to consider what your priorities are in terms of preserving that history and tying it into music.
Well, I want to say thank you. I'd like to feel like I'm an ambassador for Vollis Simpson and Whirligig Park, and also for North Carolina and Wilson and New Bern. We're all in this together, so you might as well enjoy it.
Let's go out with one of the songs, the Wind Song's Prelude. Have I got that right?
Yes, sir.
Well, thank you again for being here, Joe. Very much appreciated.
Thank you for having me.
Let's hear it. The Wind Song's Prelude by Joe Justice. You've been listening to Grace Notes, a special program here on Life 103.1 featuring people who may be relatively unknown, but who meet life's challenges in ways that brighten the lives of those around them. Our producer is Christina Dolan. I'm Alan Button, and we invite you to join all of us here at the station again next Friday at 5:30 for Grace Notes on Life 103.1.